Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Ryan Bijan, host of COWTOWN Movie Classics, and tonight we're celebrating spooky season with one of my favorite horror films from England's Hammer Films. From 1967, it's Frankenstein Created Woman, the fourth installment in Hammer's Frankenstein saga, starring the legendary Peter Cushing. Joining me today is an extremely prolific film historian, filmmaker, author, and scholar, Dr. Steve Haberman. How are you doing tonight, Steve?
I'm doing good. I don't hear any applause, but I guess I'm used to that by now. I'm doing good. So we're going to see Frankenstein Created Woman. Frankenstein Created Woman is probably the most unique, great Frankenstein movie ever made because it's not your grandfather's Frankenstein movie. This is a movie that is the work really of a cinema auteur, a man by the name of Terence Fisher. Terence Fisher was the house director for Hammer Films, and producer Anthony Hines had the wisdom, the genius really, to hire him to direct the first two installments in their Gothic revivals, their color Gothic revivals, and that was Curse of Frankenstein and what's known in this country as the Horror of Dracula, was just called Dracula in England. And Fisher brought his own interests to his approach to Gothic. And he did that by emphasizing things that were in the script and de-emphasizing things that were in the script, so that the things that interested him, the themes that he thought were important to glean from these stories, popped. And the things that interested Fisher, he said, were fairy tales, allegories, and good versus evil. And what he wanted to do in the supernatural movies was to show the presence of God, because Fisher was a Christian, not a devout Christian by his own admission, but a sincere Christian. And he believed, and so and actually it goes with the genre very much, because I mean the genre itself in dealing with the supernatural is dealing with the spiritual by definition, because the supernatural is the spiritual and the spiritual is supernatural. So it's connected. Sometimes it's explicitly connected, as in the Dracula stories. Bram Stoker uses Christian iconography, the cross and so on, and something like The Devil Rides Out, obviously. Dennis Wheatley, another Christian, wrote that story. But also in the Frankenstein stories, as approached by Fisher, he presents Frankenstein Created Woman as a kind of dark version of Cinderella, as reframed by the Marquis de Sade, because Christine, the protagonist of this movie, she's a disfigured, crippled girl, and she is being abused, sort of, by her father, at least neglected by her father, and certainly abused by the young bloods, the town bullies, and just about everybody except her boyfriend. And her boyfriend is not really Prince Charming. He's the son of a murderer who was guillotined by the town. So that's the pool that these fish are swimming in, and it's explicitly a reframing of Cinderella, but he does it in a very artistic way, so that it becomes a tragedy. His favorite director, Terence Fisher said, from the past, he was a silent movie director for 20th Century Fox, and then he made a lot of great talkies too. A man by the name of Frank Borzage. Frank Borzage made silent movies like Seventh Heaven and Street Angel, and great talkies like Moonrise, which is a masterpiece I recommend. And they were stories about outcasts falling in love, people outside of society for whatever reason, and the classic situation where with two lovers in a garret, just creating their own world while the rest of society or below them was, falling apart. And that's exactly what this movie is. That's exactly the situation of Christine and Hans. So when you're watching this, you're not going to be watching like a reframing of the James Whale Frankenstein or the Mary Shelley Frankenstein. It's going to be its own thing. Very original, very profound, very spiritual, and very tragic, very moving. Um, and Frankenstein doesn't even bring the dead back to life in that. Well, he does, I guess. He brings Christine back to life after she's committed suicide, but you don't see it. Yeah, it's something that's just a fait accompli. He does it off screen, but what he really does in this is a soul transference, and it's more black magic than it is science, mad science. And he's capturing the uncapturable, the unweighable, the intangible, a soul. And he somehow captures this from one person, a dead person, and puts it into another dead person and brings her to life. And you'll see the surprising results. It's quite a movie. I
It
envy you if you're seeing it for the first time.
it certainly is, and if I'm not mistaken, this is also one of Martin Scorsese's personal favorites.
Yeah, he said this was his favorite Hammer movie, and he's a Hammer fan. And you can see that. I mean, Scorsese was trained as a Jesuit. He's just produced a special series of docudramas about the saints for Fox. You know, it's going to be a special of little dramatizations of all the great saints. And now, very few filmmakers now in our secular age would do that, but Martin Scorsese did it. So I can totally see him getting into Frankenstein Created Woman.
Without further ado, from 1967, director Terence Fisher's Frankenstein Created Woman. As much as I love Curse of Frankenstein, Revenge of Frankenstein, as you mentioned, this movie is certainly a standout within the franchise.
Yeah, of any franchise. Yeah, I mean they really took a chance with this. That's what was great about Tony Hines, who wrote as John Elder. He he the thing that interested him about remaking these movies was doing it in a completely original way. You know, when he was told when the first one was Curse of Frankenstein, and they were going, you know, thinking about how they were going to remake the story of Frankenstein, which hadn't been done, and they were warned by Universal when they got wind of this that if they did anything that resembled the Universal movies, the makeup, the performances, the story, anything that was particular to those. And Tony Hines thought that that was great news. That meant that they could start fresh and rethink this, and they did. They put it in the 19th century, which Universal never did, except for Bride of Frankenstein, strangely, and they centered the stories around Baron Frankenstein, the Peter Cushing character, and not the monster. You know, Dr. Frankenstein is dead after the first two Universal films, and it's the adventures of the monster after that. A very limited character, by the way.
Right, well,
Which
I just wanted to say, well, let me say, I think that is the brilliance of the Hammer franchise because you have very different films exploring similar themes and ideas, but because you have the acting gravitas of Peter Cushing and you're tackling it from a different point of view, each film feels very unique for what it is. Whereas, unfortunately, like the Hammer Draculas or even like the Universal Frankensteins, it's more of a case of like Michael Myers. How many times can you bring the killer back from the dead? He's going on a rampage. It's the same thing, kind of rinse and repeat. But I think
yeah,
that's what makes the Hammer Frankenstein series so unique, is it's not that.
yeah, you're right, and that especially happened with the Universal Frankenstein's. They didn't know what to do with him, so in the last three, he's on the slab most of the time. You know,
Mm-hmm.
but Frankenstein, and they even approached Baron Frankenstein. Hammer did in different ways in different movies. You know, in Curse of Frankenstein and Frankenstein Must Be Destroyed, he's a psychopath. You know, he
Mm-hmm.
is a consciously, he's like a Nazi. He he murders people in order to get their body parts. But in some of them, like Frankenstein Created Woman and Revenge of Frankenstein and even Frankenstein and the Monster from Hell, which he's somewhat of a sociopath in. He's got some pretty crazy ideas in that. But he's more of he's got that quality. You wouldn't want to turn your back on him in those other movies, but also he's accidentally capable of doing, you know, good for certain people. You know, like the cripple in Revenge of Frankenstein. He sees the possibility of using this superior brain in this inferior body and putting it in his own homemade body that's perfect, and he thinks that that'll be perfect. Unfortunately, he never, you know, he absolutely never takes into account the presence of God because he doesn't believe in God. There's a
Mhm.
wonderful shot in Frankenstein Created Woman where he's at a trial and he's thumbing through the Bible as he's standing there waiting to be crossing down with very little interest. He's just like, there's nothing in here for me. And he puts it down. But Fisher, on the other hand, the director, was a Christian, as was Tony Hines, as was Peter Cushing. And so they emphasized Christianity in their stories, and there was always the presence of God. As I said before, the presence of God is very obvious in vampire movies because it's stark good versus stark evil. And Christian iconography, like the wafer and the cross and holy water, that's all used in vampire movies, specifically Bram Stoker Dracula. But in Frankenstein, it's a little more subtle. And what Terence Fisher does is he shows the presence of God through coincidence. What do I mean by that? In Curse of Frankenstein, Frankenstein doesn't bring the monster to life. He's not even in the lab when the monster comes to life. He's out trying to find somebody to help him, and a bolt of lightning strikes the machinery, which turns it on, which brings the monster to life. That's the presence of God. And why
Mhm.
would God bring the monster to life? To punish Frankenstein. And that's exactly what happens. In Frankenstein Must Be Destroyed, uh, Peter Cushing and the two people that he's blackmailing to help him. Another Faust story, by the way. He's the devil in that, and he's forcing two people to do the devil's bidding by
Mhm.
blackmailing them. Anyway, they kill the scientist and they bury him in the garden, and a water main breaks, and the water forces the body up out of the mud, and that reveals their crime, the presence of God. And even in Revenge of Frankenstein, he takes a great brain from a crippled body and puts it in a homemade body that's perfect, and everything's good, but the brain can't be damaged. And this sadistic sort of landlord catches our monster, but he's not a monster; he's just a man, and hits him over the head with a chair, and it damages the brain. And what happens? The perfect body that Frankenstein made starts to become crippled again, just like the body that he took that brain from, because that's the body that God wanted that brain in, was the
Mhm.
crippled man's body. So in order to punish Frankenstein, he turns the perfect body that Frankenstein made into a crippled body.
Mhm.
Again, the presence of God. And Fisher's very consistent about this. In Frankenstein Created Woman, it's a little bit different because what he's doing is, first of all, the idea itself, capturing the soul from one person and putting that's spiritual to begin with. I mean, that right there is, if there's a soul, there's a God, and if there's a God, there's a soul. Frankenstein can't do that math, but we can do that math. And so when he says he's capturing a soul, he may not think it's spiritual, he may think it's scientific, but we know that that's an intangible spiritual thing, a soul. It's not something that can be measured. So that's an act of God, not Frankenstein. And the other thing about it is he's really in that movie emphasizing the fairy tale quality of retelling Cinderella as a horror story, and also the romance, as I said before. So that's, but still, just by talking about the soul, and that's why Martin Scorsese likes this movie so much, because it's spiritual. It just is in its very conception, like a vampire movie.
Mhm. And you'd have to forgive, I mean, anyone going into this movie for the first time with the title Frankenstein Created Woman, you can't blame an audience for thinking, okay, maybe this might be a reimagining of Bride of Frankenstein or the Bride of Frankenstein concept. And I do wonder, they could have easily have done that and put their own spin on it, but what made them want to take it in such a radically different direction?
Well, the movie that was advertised, Frankenstein Created Woman, is the movie that you described. It's a sexy version of Bride of Frankenstein. That movie was never made, but the
Mhm.
posters were made for it. That's how they advertised Frankenstein Created Woman. But that's not, Terence Fisher would make a movie like that. Terence Fisher, and Tony Hines knew that. Tony Hines wrote this script with his pseudonym, John Elder, as he did many Hammer films. And he, Tony Hines, John Elder knew who he was writing for. He knew that Terence Fisher was not going to make an exploitation movie. They could sell it like an exploitation movie, but he was not going to make an exploitation movie. I mean, you can imagine this movie directed by anybody but Terence Fisher, using the kind of costuming that was later used in the Karnstein movies, you know, for Christine. But that's not what Terence Fisher did. He directed her. I mean, he dressed her like a little Tyrolean doll, but she sexually seduces the men that were responsible for her boyfriend's death, and her death too, by the way, and and murders them. But
Hmm.
she seduces them not, you know, with like a sexy outfit, or, you know, the sort of bikini outfit that is in all the publicity shots and in the posters and things for Christine. No, and they even hired a Playboy playmate to play the part, but Terence Fisher wasn't going to direct it like that.
Yeah, well, I mean, Susan Denberg is wonderful in this film. She's very gorgeous. And you have me thinking, you're right. I always think of the iconic photo shoot where you see Peter Cushing holding up the bandaged
Right.
Christina, where she's very sexy. It's almost like a bikini photo shoot. But
Yeah.
yeah, that's not really in the actual
That's
film.
No, of course not. But that's, you know, that's probably how they got 20th Century Fox to throw in for it. Is first of all, I think they were going to make a movie called Fear of Frankenstein, and Zanuck at Fox didn't like it, and that became Evil of Frankenstein over at Universal. And the movie that they were going to make after Curse of Frankenstein, the second Frankenstein movie, was Frankenstein Created Woman. And
Hmm.
that's when they started working on the screenplay. And somehow they went to Jimmy Sangster, and he came up with Revenge of Frankenstein, and that's the movie that they actually made. This was the fourth movie, and Tony Hines went back as John Elder and took that material. And actually, it was written first as an unfilmed episode of Tales from Frankenstein, which was going to be their Columbia TV series, American TV series. And that this story was going to be one of those episodes, but that series never went any further than the pilot that they shot, which is horrible. It's just terrible. But and so they finally got around to do it. They presented the title to Zanuck. He says, "Yeah, Frankenstein Created Woman. Now you're talking. Now that's a movie we can sell, right?" And then Hammer went to work making one of their classic Gothics. Tony Hines produced, and as John Elder wrote the script, knowing he was writing it for Terence Fisher, who he knew had these themes and this style and his own little preoccupations, and knew Peter Cushing was going to be in it. And, you know, it became the movie. It lived up to its potential, we'll say. And this is a very small Frankenstein movie. I mean, the little village that they live in, I mean, it looks like there's only 12 people that live in this village, but it's so visually stark the way the movie is made. It reminds me of the late Fritz Lang movies, uh,
Hmm.
where the sets are very stark and they're very simply shot and stuff, but they're dark and disturbing, and they have these themes. That this is kind of Fisher's equivalent to that, because it's so brilliant. Frankenstein and Hertz, his assistant, are in some house, someplace, doing what they're doing. To get to the village from their place, you have to pass this field where there's a guillotine. And so Fisher is constantly showing hands running back and forth past this guillotine with Fisherian autumn leaves blowing by, you know. And this guillotine is a constant reminder, first of all, of the death of Hans's father, who was a murderer and who was guillotined. And also, Hans becomes a murderer. Well, he doesn't. He's accused of murder. And he's also guillotined on the same thing. So it's this constant reminder of death, the village guillotine. So to get to the village from Frankenstein's place, you have to pass the guillotine, and to get from the village to Frankenstein's place, you got to pass this guillotine. So we're constantly being reminded of the past, of death, you know, of tragedy. And Fisher keeps telling us this is not going to end well. You know, this is a
Hmm.
Borzage movie. The lovers are going to be, you know, reunited not by Frankenstein but by death.
Certainly. And you and I certainly have a greater appreciation for Fisher as an auteur. But realistically, I'm curious, in those days, I know some other film historians try to argue Terence Fisher, he was a gun for hire, Anthony Hines, they're commissioning these scripts, Jimmy Sangster, everyone's kind of operating independently. But how much input did Terence Fisher have on the writing process?
Well, film historians like that, I dare say, have never worked on a movie
Hmm.
because there's nothing more bonding outside of the military, maybe, than working on a feature film. They don't always work out, but you get to know your especially if you make a lot of movies together,
Hmm.
you get to know your collaborators very well. You get to if you have any intelligence and any talent, you know what their strengths and weaknesses are, and they know yours. And you collaborate based on that. And you don't come up with consistent themes and consistent style randomly with separate satellites kind of clashing together. Plus, I mean, they made tons of movies together. Anthony Hines and Peter Cushing and Terence Fisher. It wasn't just one movie like people come together now. So they discussed it. They discussed every aspect of it. Hammer Films was like a cottage industry. These film historians, they really don't. I think it would behoove any film historian and certainly any critic to at least work on a movie, if not make a movie.
Hmm. Absolutely. No, certainly. But I think there is a way, and I think it's very sort of undermining of a lot of directors, even within the old Hollywood studio system. It's like, well, can you really credit them as the auteur when they're working in this kind of factory environment or
Well,
what?
sometimes you can and sometimes you can't. I mean,
Hmm.
the the great auteurs, Alfred Hitchcock, John Ford, Howard Hawks, Orson Welles, they worked in that factory, but
Hmm.
they tamed it, you know? Sometimes it tamed them, but more than often they tamed it for their own personal movies.
Hmm.
Many directors are just guns for hire. I
Yeah.
dare say even a great technician like Michael Curtiz was a gun for hire. He knew how to make great movies, but
Right.
he didn't really have a distinguishable personality and distinguishable themes that went from because he'd made every kind of genre and he was good in almost every kind. He could make musicals, he could make horror movies, he could make noir, he could make war movies, he could make everything. He made a western with John Wayne, the Comancheros. I mean, he was a great technician, but he's not an auteur.
Yeah, I had this conversation. Do you know Alan K. Rhodey? He's an author,
Yeah.
film historian. He wrote the book on Michael Curtiz. But yeah, it's just like the only consistent style Michael Curtiz had was he just happened to make some of the greatest movies of all time.
Well,
Adventures
he
of
had
Robin Hood has nothing in common with Casablanca, but they're both amazing films.
right, but I mean, he was a great technician, though. He's great with the moving camera. He was great
Yeah.
with color. He was great with angles, and he was a perfect technician. There's a million directors like that, but he
Hmm.
didn't. It's you don't even have to stick to one genre. Look at Howard Hawks. He made one of the greatest westerns, Red River. He made one of the greatest detective movies, The Big Sleep. He made one of the greatest science fiction movies, The Thing. He made many great westerns, like, well, I said that, Red River,
Yeah.
also Rio Bravo. He made great musicals like Gentlemen Prefer Blondes. He made great comedies like Bringing Up Baby and His Girl Friday. And but each one of them is about professionalism. It's about
Hmm.
self-esteem. It's about respect. All those themes, no matter what the genre is, are in Hawks movies. And
Well, you just
his style is very consistent. It's very observational. It's not subjective at all. It's very objective. And he
well,
does
real quick, now that you mention it, those are the themes of the original Scarface, which Howard Hawks also directed.
exactly one of great gangster movies. Yeah,
Yeah.
and they're great in their genre, but they're also great because they keep displaying Hawks's very profound, almost religion about professionalism, about being good at what you do, finding self-respect in that, respecting others because of that. And feminists love Howard Hawks because if a woman is good at what she does, she's in the group. Come
Hmm.
on in. If you're no good, you're no good. Nobody wants to know you, but you get chances. You can prove yourself even when you've screwed up. I mean, Hawks was a profound filmmaker.
No, he's a great filmmaker. And certainly Terence Fisher does have those through lines throughout all of his horror work.
Yeah, right, right, exactly. I mean, that's why he didn't do Gaston Leroux's Phantom of the Opera. He did Terence Fisher's Phantom of the Opera. It's an allegory. In his Phantom of the Opera, it's a story of the devil, the Michael Goff character, seducing a Faust character, the Phantom character, for his soul, which is his music. He gets the Phantom, the Herbert Lom character, to sell him his music for rent, basically, right?
Mhm.
And then the devil character puts his name on it, right? And the whole story then is not the Phantom in love with this girl and because he's ugly, he can't get her and all this kind of stuff. That has nothing to do with the Terence Fisher. It's about a man trying to regain his soul. He's trying to he's trying to have his music perform the way he wants it performed. And in the end, he does regain his soul. And that's what's so moving about that movie. In the end, the devil is exposed. And this is a metaphorical devil. He's not the literal devil, but he's as in an allegory. It's all metaphor. It's all symbolism. Um, the devil is exposed, and his music is rightfully attributed to him and is performed. And before he dies, he regains his soul. And that's an allegory just using the ingredients of the original story of the Phantom of the Opera. And many people resent the movie because it's not a remake of Gaston Leroux or Lon Chaney or Claude Rains. No, it's something even more impressive. It's taking those ingredients and making something completely personal out of it, an allegory by Terence Fisher.
Right, and I'm a tremendous fan of the Herbert Lom, Terence Fisher Phantom of the Opera. And what's interesting, as you said, this is not the original novel, but in a lot of ways, it became one of the most influential versions of the tale because without it, you would never have Phantom of the Paradise.
Right,
You would never have the Robert Englund Phantom of the Opera, which is also very much a Faustian tale. So
right.
some of these subsequent versions, they owe a lot to Terence Fisher's vision.
Oh yeah. Phantom of the Paradise is a parody. It's a direct remake.
Yeah,
The devil, I mean, Brian De Palma was not artistic enough to use allegory. He just made him the devil.
right. Well, and wasn't there some legal issue with that? I think I had read at some point Hammer tried suing the production company behind Phantom of the Paradise because it was so similar to their version. Have you heard anything about that?
No, but that's rich coming from Hammer, who based
Of course.
their whole career is about remakes and rethoughts and reboots, and but they at least they did rethink everything and they approached it from a very fresh angle.
Right. Okay, well, I guess one thing I want to bring up since we are talking about the Hammer Frankenstein series, nowadays, I guess ever since home video became prominent now with streaming, people are able to watch these movies back to back, right? If you want to have a Frankenstein marathon, you can. And contemporary audiences, they seem more continuity minded, right? So when you're watching each Frankenstein film, to me, Curse of Frankenstein, Revenge of Frankenstein, they go together pretty well. But after a certain point, they start to become sort of standalone stories. Was this intentional? Was it sort of a rights issue between the various studios making these movies? I mean, do you feel that there is a literal continuity between each film?
No, I don't. I don't, especially with if you throw Evil of Frankenstein into the mix, because that's
Right.
like a reboot of a movie, or it's actually a sequel to a movie that was never made.
Hmm.
The monster's completely different. They just took the ingredients from the old Frankenstein sequels and tried to make something out of it, and it's a mess, I think. I don't like
Yeah.
I mean, it's beautifully made because Freddie Francis is a very skilled non-auteur technician director. But no, I don't think that there's a direct continuity between them. You just see Peter Cushing getting older and going from one adventure to another. That's the continuity.
Yeah. And I always thought the through line was he always had a sidekick named Hans, right? You have Dr. Hans Cleve in
Right,
Revenge of Frankenstein.
right.
And so I don't suppose those are all the same character either.
No, probably not. They only have two names in Bavaria, Hans and Paul. Those are the only two. Yeah, you're either Paul or Hans in those countries. That's a
Right.
well-known.
And I think in all the Dracula movies, there was always a guy named Paul in one of the Dracula
Yeah,
films.
right. And some Hans.
There's some Hans. It's some Every once in a while, you get a Ludwig.
Yeah, that's an older character.
Oh, right, right. All right, Steve, do you have any other closing thoughts on Frankenstein Created Woman?
Frankenstein Created Woman is a gift from the cinema gods. It's a movie that shouldn't have happened, but it did because it was a confluence of very talented, very creative people that came together to try to make the Frankenstein movie nobody else would make, and they did it, and it was successful. And I think everybody should enjoy it.
Oh, absolutely. Now, if anyone in the audience is a fan of the British horror films of the 60s and 70s, Dr. Haberman just released a book that might be of interest to you.
Yes, I wrote a book about another auteur team, Gordon Hessler and Christopher Wicking, just being rediscovered, mostly by me. And the book is called Gothic for Radicals. And it's about the four Gothic horror movies that this team, Gordon Hessler and Christopher Wicking, made for American International Pictures in 1969, 1970, and 1971. And that's The Oblong Box, Scream and Scream Again, Cry of the Banshee, and Murders in the Rue Morgue. And I highly recommend that you see those movies and then read my book.
Certainly. Well, Dr. Steve Haberman, once again, thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure.
If you're in the audience, I hope you enjoyed tonight's film and conversation as much as we had having it. Once again, I'm Ryan Bijan. We'll see you next time.